Hi, students of Paul. Welcome to this short video lecture on the deutero-Pauline book of Colossians, which together with Ephesians and 2nd Thessalonians constitute the so-called deutero-Pauline epistles. There are basically three different levels in critical theory in considering the Pauline corpus in the New Testament. A lot of scholars believe that there are only seven undisputed, well, there are only seven undisputed Pauline epistles. But there are three so-called deutero-Paulines: Colossians, Ephesians, and 2nd Thessalonians. And then there are the pastoral letters, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, which most critical scholars, most biblical scholars don't believe were written actually by Paul, but later, as much as 50 to 80 years later after Paul. So this is a Roman mosaic or a Byzantine mosaic in the city or the ruins of Philippi. Which is on the ground, and that's the picture that you'd see in front of you. Background to the letter of Colossians. Colossae was in the Lycus or the Lycus Valley of Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. So again, this continues the basic Pauline, the Pauline letters that we have, for the most part, are to communities in modern-day Greece or Turkey and around the Aegean Sea, just to situate it geographically. Colossae was close to Laodicea, a larger imperial center of that time, a Roman imperial center. It had a fairly large community, but it was destroyed by an earthquake sometime between 60 and 64. So in other words, right around near the end of Paul's life, if as I've been saying, we think that Paul was probably executed under the reign of Nero in Rome around the same time. Colossae was destroyed by an earthquake, and it's never been rebuilt. And in fact, it has yet, I think, to be excavated in terms of archaeological digs. Colossians 1:7-8 suggests that Paul neither founded the community nor was known personally to them. So in other words, he would not necessarily have visited them, but that someone named Epaphras had founded the Jesus community there. We'll find out that there's another a purported Pauline connection in terms of the people carrying the letter. So we're not going to go through the entire text that I've put here for you, but I've put quite a large chunk of text here for you to take a look, just because I want to make sure that you have the primary text. This is basically the first chapter of Colossians. And what I want to point out very briefly is that Colossians does start like the undisputed Pauline letters. So it has a proper first century letter structure. It begins with his name, he describes himself, an apostle of Christ Jesus. There's a co-sender, Timothy, and then the addressees to the saints and faithful brothers and sisters in Christ in Colossae. And then there's the benediction, grace to you. So far, so good. It's all very much like a Pauline letter, which, by the way, Ephesians is not. So Colossians and Ephesians, two of these deutero-Paulines, share some kind of literary relationship. And Ephesians lacks in the oldest manuscripts addressee. So the words to the Ephesians are missing from some of the oldest manuscripts that we have, which makes some scholars wonder if Ephesians is a circular letter, and whether Colossians and Ephesians may have been adapted from the other. I will feel free to pause this video and take a look at this chapter, or to take a look at the PowerPoint, which is posted on Moodle. But I'll just point out a couple of other different things here. The hope laid up for you in heaven, I've highlighted. Heaven is not a concept that Paul uses very often in the undisputed letters, because basically God's realm will take place on earth. There will be a rejuvenated earth at the beginning of the day of the Lord, and will continue here on earth. Then later on in verses 11 and 12 and so on, giving thanks to the Father who has enabled you to share in the inheritance of the saints in the light. Again, just a bit of an unusual expression for Paul from the Paul that we know from the undisputed letters. He has rescued us from the power of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his Son. So you have light and darkness being contrasted in a way that's much more like the Johannine letters, or even the Gospel of John, than like the undisputed Paulines. And then there's a very high Christological statement. Now, what does that mean? It means that the person of Jesus is put very, very highly. It's very much like Philippians chapter 2, which is undisputed Paul. So here it says, he is the image of the firstborn son. image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and earth were created, things visible and invisible, thrones, dominions, rulers, powers. That sounds Paul. All things have been created through him and for him. This begins again to sound more like John. And then on to verse 24, Paul writes, or the writer, I should say, of Colossians writes, I am now rejoicing in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I am completing what is lacking in Christ's afflictions. Again, that's just a little twig of something that sounds not quite like the Paul that we know from the letters, although Paul was certainly saying, imitate me. And there's a concern here for wisdom as well, which is more language of the 2nd century than the first. So some interesting verses. I've pointed some out already, but let's take a look. Verse 13, kingdom of his beloved son. In the undisputed letters, Paul only ever talks about the kingdom or the realm of God, never the realm of Jesus. Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, for sure, for Paul, and brings about the new reign. But the kingdom of Jesus is a bit of an unusual language. And again, it's moved the direction of the thinking about Jesus to something that resembles more Christian theology later. Verse 15 is the image of the invisible God, and so on. And I've highlighted the Philippians passage and the John passages that look very similar to that. And then this light and darkness, again, here I am highlighting for you some of the passages which are a little bit like that in Undisputed Paul from 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Finally, Colossians 1:28, teaching everyone in all wisdom, and the Greek word for that is gnosis. And Colossians 2:8, which you don't have in front of you, says, see that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deceit. So there's some kind of a message here about philosophy and about true wisdom, which again is very much like what begins to happen to Christian teaching as it moves into the Gentile world and the Roman world, or the non-Jewish Roman world, and further away from its roots in Judea and in the Galilee. All right, so Colossians is starting to sound more and more, with all of these hints, it sounds less and less like the undisputed Paul. But one of the clinchers for that is the idea that the resurrection in Colossians is portrayed as something that has already happened in some ways. So for instance, in Romans chapter 6, where an undisputed letter, Paul writes, for if we have been united with him in a death like his, we shall certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. And the undisputed Paul means next week, next month, next year, this will happen, and it will happen certainly to you. And it's already starting in baptism, but it is certainly not yet complete. Now compare that to Colossians chapter 2, verse 12, where the writer says, when you were buried with him in baptism, you were also raised with him. And you go, what? You were also raised with him through the faith in the power of God who raised him from the dead. So it's metaphorizing the resurrection, which I don't think Paul would ever do. And it's also putting it in the past, which again, Paul is not. He's looking forward, very much forward to a resurrection coming soon, next week, next month, next year. Verse 13, God made you alive together with him when he forgave us all our trespasses. So if you have been raised with Christ, chapter 3, verse 1, seek the things that are above where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. So this is starting to sound like Jesus is permanently in heaven, and we are permanently not. Here, the followers of Jesus, according to this text, are permanently not. And you begin to get this idea of you pass your life on earth and you go to heaven or hell, depending on what you believe, which is a later Christian development, instead of the awaiting the day of the Lord, where the world is transformed and there is a judgment, but it all happens right here. So again, there's a metaphorizing of resurrection, and there is a putting it off or putting it back into the past, and you have been metaphorically raised already with Christ, which again, in his undisputed letters, Paul just simply does not say. Next up, in Colossians and Ephesians, you get this thing called the household code, which was well known outside. It certainly was not in any way a Jesus movement invention, but well known in the Roman world. It was a common description of a patriarchal family. It was used by moral philosophers as well, without any reference to Jesus or to the God of Israel. And you see this moral code again and again, especially well developed in the pastoral letters, 1 Timothy, and I've given some of the references here, 1 Timothy and Titus. So what is the household code? Essentially, it is a set of rules for the managing of a household, of a Roman household. That means husbands and wives. It means masters and enslaved persons, and parents and children. And this household code is a code of conduct. How do you get along in one of these large families, large households? Now, Paul didn't talk about this at all, because the undisputed Paul in the undisputed letters basically said, stay the way you are, because next month it's going to be the reign of God and everything will be changed and we will all be transformed in the blink of an eye at the call of the trump. But this doesn't sound like it. Listen to this. Wives, be subject to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord, and husbands, love your wives and never treat them harshly. In relative terms, in the first century, this is a fairly liberal conception of the relations between the genders, but it doesn't necessarily sound Pauline for all of that. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this is your acceptable duty. Notice that these rules seem to be set up for the long-term balancing and management and continuation of the family, which is, again, not what Paul was on about at all in his undisputed letters. So take some time to read this. It says, masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, for you know that you also have a master. Again, John Dominic Crossan would call this the liberal view of Paul, because it's quite egalitarian in a very limited way, but for the first century, for its context, it's fairly progressive, I would say. But it is not in any way like Paul, who basically says everything will be turned upside down next week, next month, next year in the kingdom. And the Paul who uses the baptismal formula to say neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, nor male and female. And here's a little exercise that you can do on your own. You can pause the video and take a look at it, but do take a look at what's the status of men and women, slaves and masters in relation to each other. And do you think that this passage is any different from the rest of Roman society at the time? And then take a look at question 3 as well. Let's move on to the next slide. There are warnings in Colossians against false philosophies and teachings. Colossians 2:1, see to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deceit. So again, this warning against gnosis, against some sort of false teaching, which is very indicative of the 2nd century in Christian teaching, but not so much of Paul. The movement had simply not been around long enough for this kind of thing to develop. Colossians 2:16-23, therefore do not let anyone condemn you in matters of food and drink, or of observing festivals, new moons, or Sabbaths. These are only a shadow of what is to come. Do not let anyone disqualify you, going on, dwelling on visions, puffed up without cause by human way, do not holding fast to the head. This language does not sound like Paul. And finally, verse 20, if with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the universe, these are gods, remember. Listen, think about Fredrickson talking about the world being crowded with humans and their gods, and gods and their humans. Why do you live as if you still belong to the world? Why do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. Again, the Paul from the undisputed letters basically said, just follow the rules, because the rules themselves will be turned over soon. And then this, again, a reference in verse 23 to wisdom. These indeed have the appearance of wisdom in promoting self-imposed piety, humility, and severe treatment of the body, but they are of no value in checking self-indulgence. This all sounds like a movement which is planning to be around for a while and is telling its members, here's how to live. And Paul, again, had very little, he wanted people to behave properly with love, but really it was very short, and a very short time before everything would be changed and God would be in control, the God of Israel. So Colossians here, some other things. Colossians' differences from the undisputed letters in style and theology. Let's take a look at those. Warnings against false teachers. Simply not there for the most part in the undisputed, in fact, not at all, I think, in the undisputed letters, other than in Galatians, the so-called super apostles, and 2 Corinthians. The content and nature of the false teaching are very difficult to determine. In Colossians and Ephesians, it's a little bit vague. We don't even know what it is. A higher Christology than we have seen so far, except perhaps in Philippians 2. But very much developed in a way similar to John's gospel, and not in a way similar to the undisputed letters. Almost no emphasis on the Spirit. This is an important one. Paul always talks about the Spirit. And this is not often pointed out, but Paul always talks about the Spirit, and Colossians and Ephesians make very little reference to the Spirit and the fruits of the Spirit or the works of the Spirit. or the fact that the Spirit bears witness, all of these things that are in undisputed Paul. Much less emphasis on the coming day of the Lord. That's really a red flag. Very little emphasis on the coming day of the Lord, perhaps some references. And then this emphasis on the Roman family unit, which is the man at the head, his wife, his children, his slaves, all in a pyramid underneath him in pater familias. Pauline language in Colossians, it's true, the opening sounds very much like a Pauline letter. It has a superscription and an exordium or thanksgiving. The closing also sounds very much like a typical Pauline letter. And it says that Paul is in prison. It places him as one of the prison letters. And the instruction is to read the letter to the other churches, which is interesting because this shows the sort of proto-scriptural nature of Paul's writing. Once it starts to be read in the assemblies, then it starts to be treated as a scriptural writing. Non-Pauline themes, higher Christology. Jesus becomes less and less human and more permanently in heaven, as opposed to the Christ or the Messiah who is going to inaugurate the day of the Lord here. The lack of eschatological urgency, it just simply does not sound urgent, Colossians or Ephesians. The much greater attention to traditional family structure. And again, why would family structure be important for a movement that's only going to be around very briefly? And Paul makes it clear in the other letters that structure is not that important to him, except in the moment and for functional reasons. The vagueness of the warning against false teaching and the teachery and less passionate, less personal style of writing. So this is a new slide that's not in the previous version of this slide, of this PowerPoint that was posted. So I just want you to pay special attention to this, a point-by-point comparison, Colossians and Ephesians. In Colossians and Ephesians, believers are already transformed by Christ's death and resurrection, but in Paul's undisputed letters, believers will be transformed by Christ's death and resurrection. It's starting now, but it has very much not come to fruition. In Colossians and Ephesians, the emphasis is on the Roman household code as a guide for relationships in households. In Paul's undisputed letters, their emphasis is on the baptismal formula, an eschatological, the eschaton guides relations, which is, yes, you might be enslaved for now, but soon you will be equal, or you might be a master for now, but soon you will be equal with your brothers or sisters in Christ. In Colossians and Ephesians, the focus is on wisdom, on this gnosis, and on false teaching. In Paul's undisputed letters, the focus is on Gentiles and how they fit into the movement, and themes of righteousness and justification. How is it that non-Jews actually come into this movement? Very little emphasis in Ephesians and Colossians on that. Ephesians and Colossians, high style, almost liturgical, indirect, and quite wordy. In Paul's undisputed letters, plain direct style focused on specific problems. Now, Sylvia Kiesmat in the New Cambridge Commentary and others sometimes talk about this as being a difference in audience, that they say, well, Paul was writing to a different Eastern Greek influenced, much more sort of ornate and wordy group of people who appreciated this kind of high liturgical style. And that's why it has that different style. And other people might say, well, this is much more the case than of Paul's co-writers taking over and doing most of the work. And that's their style, not so much Paul's. But at some point it becomes then not Paul's letter, frankly, if you take in all of that into consideration. So was Colossians written by Paul? Many biblical scholars believe it was not. Some, as Sylvia Kiesmat, think it perhaps was. And I'll leave that for you. What do you think? So I hope you enjoyed that, and it explains something about this PowerPoint and about Colossians. It's an introduction to a very interesting book. There's much more to say about it, and I hope you continue to study and look at it for a long time to come. Thanks. Talk to you again soon. Bye for now.